The wind crawled through the dying branches like it was carrying a secret, low, mournful, and biting cold. It was the kind of Texas winter that didn't howl, just pressed in heavy and silent, like grief. Silas Boone sat hunched on the porch of his weather-worn ranch house, a man carved from wood and sorrow. He'd once been a husband, a father, a Union scout who could track a deer in moonlight. Now, he just listened to the wind. He hadn't spoken to a soul in near 2 years. Not since the fire. Not since that night when 6 riders came out of nowhere, took what they wanted, and left the rest burning. His wife, Lily. His daughter, June. Buried under rocks behind the barn. He dug the graves with his own blistered hands, eyes dry, lips cracked, chest empty. That morning, Silas hadn't noticed anything different. He tended to his one surviving horse, boiled coffee that tasted like ash, and tried not to remember her laughter. Then came the crunch of something light on gravel. He turned his head, slow and cautious, like an old animal smelling danger. But what he saw froze him. She couldn't have been more than 7. A small girl in a too-big dress, threadbare, barefoot in the frost. Her hair was matted, one braid unraveling, and her cheeks were raw from the cold. But it was her voice that hollowed out the air between them. "Can you buy this bread?" she whispered, holding out a misshapen, crumbling crust wrapped in a cloth that had once been white. Silas stared. His throat tightened. Not because of the bread. Not even because of the girl. But because her eyes were the same gray as June's. Not similar. The same. He tried to blink it away, but the past didn't let go that easy. She held the bread like it was worth gold. Her little hand trembled. In the other hand, barely clutched, was a rusty coin, Confederate issue, worthless now. She didn't know. She thought she was buying mercy. He stood slowly. The wood creaked under his boot. She flinched, took a step back. "No," he rasped, his voice dry from disuse. "You keep your coin." Her eyes welled. He didn't know if it was gratitude or shame. He turned and went inside. Came back with a small loaf from his last batch, still warm, wrapped it in a clean cloth. When he handed it to her, she clutched it to her chest like she'd won the lottery. Then she ran. She ran like she didn't trust the moment would last. Into the trees. Into silence. He should have let her go. Should have turned back to his empty house and forgotten her. But something old and broken inside him stirred. Maybe it was the ghost of June whispering through the pine. Maybe it was the way the girl had looked behind her shoulder, once, before disappearing, like she wanted someone to follow, but didn't know how to ask. He saddled his horse, Old Buck, and rode slow, quiet. Not to chase. Just to see. The trail was faint but visible, child-sized prints in the frost, a broken twig, the occasional smear of red from chapped hands. She was heading deeper into the timberlands, where no ranchers went anymore, not since the war ended and lawmen stopped patrolling. He found the first sign of her life an hour in, a wool shawl caught on a low branch, snagged and torn. Silas dismounted, slipped it free, and held it to his face. It smelled of smoke and sickness. Another mile and the wind changed. Carried a cough. Faint, wheezing, but unmistakable. He crept forward, hand near his holster, just in case. The trees parted around a hunter's cabin long abandoned, half-rotted door, moss creeping up the side, but with a dim fire glowing inside. He approached slow. No sound but the wind. Then a shadow darted across the window. He stepped into the doorway and raised one hand. "I ain't here to harm." Inside, the girl crouched beside a bundle on a cot, her mother, or what was left of her. Fevered, gaunt, and fading fast. The woman opened one eye, then closed it again, too weak to lift her head. "I brung bread," he said gently. The girl nodded. No words. Just tears. He entered, set the bread down, stoked the fire. Found the kettle. There was barely enough wood for the night. No meat. No blankets worth the name. And the storm was coming. As he sat beside the fire, his eyes kept drifting to the girl. She huddled beside her mother like a pup beside its dying dam. She never begged. never pleaded. Just sat there, silent and small, watching the stranger with the quiet hope of a child too used to being disappointed. Her name, he learned the next morning, was Clara. And in that moment, with snow beginning to drift outside and death in the corner of the room, Silas Boone knew something he hadn't known in years. He couldn't walk away. Not this time. Not again. By morning, the snow had thickened its grip on the woods, laying a hush over everything. The storm hadn't broken in full yet, but it was circling, ready to fall. Silas Boone stepped out of the cabin, boots crunching against frost-hardened earth, his breath rising in slow puffs. He chopped what little firewood he could find near the shed, hands steady despite the cold. He hadn't spoken again, and Clara hadn't asked him to. Inside, the fire flickered low. Clara knelt by her mother, dabbing her brow with a damp rag. The woman's skin was pale yellow under the dim light, breath rattling in her chest like dry leaves in wind. Silas knew that sound. The same his Lily had made before the fever took her. There would be no miracle. Only time and dignity, if that. He handed Clara the last of the broth he'd managed to stretch from beans and dried deer sinew. She took it with both hands, murmured, "Thank you," almost inaudibly. It was the first time she'd spoken directly since the porch. That single word, soft as snow, lodged in his ribs. He stayed through the day, fixing the roof with salvaged wood, sealing cracks with old hide. Not to impose, just to keep the cold from swallowing them whole. Every now and then he'd glance out beyond the trees, scanning the ridge line. He felt eyes on them, the kind a man recognizes from years of war and frontier survival. But there was nothing but snow. Until just before dusk. A rabbit hung from a branch, its neck snapped clean. No trap. No sign of a predator. Silas found it 30 yards from the cabin, near a half-buried trail he hadn't noticed before. Below the branch there were footprints, barefoot, deliberate, wide-set. He didn't bring the rabbit in. Just dressed it, cooked it outside, and offered a piece to Clara with a nod. Her eyes widened, then softened. She took a piece to her mother's lips, but the woman didn't respond. That night she passed. It happened quietly, during the black hours, with only the fire to bear witness. Clara didn't scream, didn't cry. She just curled into her mother's side and stayed that way until dawn. Silas covered the woman in her shawl and stepped out to dig. The earth was hard, but he worked in silence, same as he had for his own. By the time he returned, Clara had braided her mother's hair and folded her hands neatly across her chest. She said not to be scared, Clara whispered, voice steady. Silas nodded. He wrapped the body gently, carried it out into the snow, and laid her to rest beneath a lone pine. Clara placed the worthless coin beside her cheek. Afterward, she didn't speak for days. The storm hit full the following night. Snow piled heavy against the door, wind wailing like the ghosts of the dead. The fire barely held. Clara sat close to Silas now, drawing warmth from the wool blanket he'd wrapped around them both. He gave her his gloves and coat without comment. The rabbit was gone. Food was scarce. But every evening, something new appeared just outside the cabin. Dried herbs, more wood, once even strips of cured meat. Silas never saw who left them, but the footprints, large, barefoot, deliberate, came and went without fail. Then, on the 6th night, Silas finally saw him. A figure standing among the trees, face barely lit by moonlight breaking through the clouds. Tall, broad-shouldered, wrapped in leather and wolf fur. Scars traced down his cheek like claw marks, and a single braid hung over his shoulder. He made no move, no sound. Just stared. Silas didn't raise his rifle. Just stepped forward a pace. "Been you, huh?" he said. The man gave no reply. Only inclined his head once, then vanished into the trees like a shadow returning to its source. Later that night Clara asked, who was he? Silas stared into the fire, memory tugging at the edges of his mind. Used to be scouts like him. Before the war. Good ones. Better than us. Called themselves the people of the dawn. Is he dangerous? Maybe, Silas said quietly. But if he meant harm, we'd be gone already. In the days that followed, trust grew not through words but deeds. Silas taught Clara how to tie knots, ride the old horse buck in small circles. She laughed once, when the horse bucked and Silas nearly fell. The sound startled them both. She blushed. He just smiled faintly and tipped his hat. Their survival became a rhythm: fire, foraging, watching the trees. And always, the quiet sense they were being protected from just beyond the line of sight. Once, when Clara tripped and gashed her knee, the scout appeared again, this time just long enough to toss a bundle of roots at Silas's feet. When Silas looked up, the man was already gone. He used them. The wound healed fast. Silas began to leave small tokens at the trail's edge: salt, a strip of smoked meat, one of June's carved wooden toys. Not as repayment, but as acknowledgement. The balance was delicate, wordless, but real. And yet, beneath all this quiet survival, danger still hovered like a hawk circling above. Something about the abandoned cabin nagged at Silas. Bullet holes in the side walls. A broken window pane with what looked like dried blood on the sill. The woman hadn't gotten sick here, she'd fled to it. Something had chased her. One morning, Clara showed him a patch of cloth she'd found wedged between floorboards. It bore a stitched insignia, a brand Silas hadn't seen since the war. A pair of crossed pistols under a crown. His jaw tightened. He'd seen that brand once, burned into the chest of a raider who'd helped torch his ranch. A gang that hadn't vanished after Appomattox. Just hid better. Smarter. They were still out there. Still hunting. And now they might have followed the girl. Silas stood at the doorway, rifle slung over his shoulder, eyes narrowed at the tree line. Snow falling. Sky low and gray. The storm may have passed, but the worst of the cold was still ahead. The fire burned low as Silas stood guard just inside the cabin door, his rifle resting against the frame, his breath steady but sharp. A storm still churned in the distance, but the snow had softened into a fine whisper. The silence outside had changed. It wasn't the calm of safety anymore. It was the pause before thunder. Clara sat on the cot, small knees pulled to her chest, eyes wide and alert. She hadn't spoken all morning, but she knew. Children could feel when something dark was coming, even before grown men would admit it. She clutched the wooden toy Silas had carved days earlier, a little horse, and waited. Dakota appeared at first light. He stepped from the trees like the forest had spit him out, silent, urgent, every line of his body taut. He didn't enter the cabin. Just raised his hand, 2 fingers extended. Silas moved to the door, meeting him halfway through the snow. They followed the storm, Dakota said quietly, voice rough as bark. Silas didn't ask how many. He didn't need to. He could see it in Dakota's eyes. The riders, those same raiders who'd left scars across both their pasts, were coming. How long? Silas asked. Before sundown, Dakota replied. They're close. Too close. Silas looked back at the cabin, then toward the ridge. We can't outrun him. Dakota gave a single nod. They returned to the cabin, 2 ghosts bound by vengeance, grief, and an unspoken oath to protect what was still worth saving. Clara looked at them both. She didn't cry. She simply nodded, understanding more than a child should. They had hours to prepare. Silas and Dakota worked without words. The cabin's windows were reinforced with timber plank. A narrow trench was dug along the back. They laid snares, set trap, piled firewood in strange patterns that could be lit fast and bright. Dakota drew symbols in the snow, warding mark. Maybe superstition, maybe not. Silas didn't question them. Inside, Clara helped in quiet ways, handing nails, tying knot. Her small fingers trembled, but her jaw was set. When Silas handed her a slingshot and a pouch of small stones, she held it like it was sacred. You stay low, he told her. Only if there's no choice. She nodded once. Then the sun began to drop. They came at twilight, 5 of them, faces wrapped in scarves, silhouettes carved from hunger and greed. One rode ahead, a cruel smirk on his lips, his coat tattered but marked with the same crossed pistols insignia Silas had found. He didn't recognize Silas. That was good. "Cabin's ours now," the man shouted, voice carrying through the trees. "Don't make us work for it." Silas didn't reply. He waited. Dakota had vanished into the woods, bow ready. The silence stretched. Then a hawk cried overhead. The first shot rang out. The rider fell from his horse, arrow lodged in his throat. The others scattered, scrambling for cover, rifles drawn. The night exploded into chaos, gunfire flashing like lightning, shadows darting between trees. Silas dropped the second with a clean shot through the chest. The third rushed the cabin, only to trip the wire and vanish into the trench, snapping his leg as he fell. He screamed. Another shot silenced him. Smoke curled from the fire traps, blinding the rest. Dakota moved like mist, appearing, striking, disappearing again. But one made it through. He burst into the cabin, rifle raised. Silas wasn't fast enough. The man leveled the weapon at Clara. Then a stone hit him square between the eyes. He staggered, just long enough for Silas to tackle him, wrestle the gun free. They fought hard, boots crashing into the wall, fists cracking bone. In the struggle, Clara backed into the corner, eyes locked, heart pounding. Silas drove the man's head into the floor once, twice. He stopped moving. Silence returned, broken only by the ragged rasp of Silas' breath. Outside, Dakota staggered back into view, blood running down his side. He dropped to one knee but stayed upright. The last rider fled, disappearing into the dark woods. He wouldn't be back. Silas helped Dakota inside. The wound was deep, a clean bullet through the flesh, no bone. He patched it as best he could, Clara kneeling beside him with steady hands. As they worked, snow began to fall again, this time gently, without malice. They buried the dead away from the cabin, unmarked. No names. No stones. Just the cold swallowing them whole. Dakota leaned on Silas as they returned, his strength fading but his eyes calm. Later that night they sat by the fire, Silas, Clara, and Dakota. No words passed between them for a long while. Just the quiet pop of the flames and the occasional wind brushing the walls. Clara was the first to speak. "Are we safe now?" Silas didn't answer right away. He looked to Dakota, who gave a slow nod. "For now," Silas said. "But safe's not always forever." Clara rested her head on his arm. Dakota smiled faintly, then closed his eyes. Come morning, Silas made a choice. The cabin was no longer shelter. It had become a graveyard. Too much pain lingered in the walls. He saddled Buck, wrapped Dakota's wound tight, and bundled Clara in his coat. They didn't leave with much. Just what mattered. The wooden toy. A sack of dried meat. The memory of what they'd survived. As they crossed the ridge, Clara turned and looked back at the place that had both saved and scarred them. Silas reached down, squeezed her hand. They walked into the white, toward the horizon, footprints vanishing behind them with every step. Behind them, Dakota paused, looking one last time at the tree line. Then he followed, limping but upright. A shadow no longer, just a man who chose to stay. Some things are lost forever. Others are found in the quiet moments after gunfire, when the world dares to begin again. And sometimes, the faintest whisper of a little girl is all it takes to thaw a frozen heart. They moved slow through the snow, three figures bound not by blood, but by shared scars and silences. Days passed without speech, only the rhythm of footsteps and wind through pine branches filling the air. Silas Boone led the way, rifle slung low across his back, Clara bundled behind him on Buck, and Dakota bringing up the rear, limping but never falling behind. Each man carried his own ghosts, but for the first time, none of them walked alone. The landscape changed as they headed south, less snow, more open skies. The harsh edges of winter softened into the bare promise of spring. They passed empty farmsteads, rusted fences, and towns that looked like they'd forgotten how to breathe. No one asked questions. No one stopped them. They reached the town of Dry Creek 3 days later, low on supplies and even lower on words. It wasn't much. A saloon with a warped sign, a general store barely standing, and a chapel with missing windows. But it was enough. Silas tied Buck outside the store, lifted Clara down gently, and looked into her pale gray eyes. She hadn't spoken since the cabin, but something had shifted in her. She no longer flinched when touched. No longer stared at the ground when spoken to. Inside the store, the old shopkeeper eyed them warily. Silas placed coins on the counter, enough for bread, flour, matches, and a bit of salt pork. The man hesitated, looking over Silas's shoulder at Dakota. "He don't cause trouble," Silas said, voice low but firm. The shopkeeper nodded slowly and slid the goods forward without a word. As they exited, Clara tugged on Silas's coat. She pointed across the street, to a young mother sitting on the church steps with 2 children in torn clothes, shivering. She held out the bread they'd just bought. Silas knelt beside her. "You sure?" he asked softly. Clara nodded. They crossed the street and handed over the bread. The mother looked up with red eyes and whispered a thank you. One of the children, no older than 5, reached out and touched Clara's hand. Clara smiled. It was faint, like a candle just lit, but it was real. That night, they camped just outside of town, under a sky full of stars. Dakota brewed a bitter tea from pine needles, and Silas carved another wooden figure, this one a hawk. He handed it to Clara without ceremony. She held it tight. Dakota finally spoke, voice gravelly from disuse. "Where now?" Silas stared into the fire. "There's a place east. My brother's old land. Fertile, mostly untouched. Maybe still standing. You trust your brother?" "He died in Virginia. But the land's there." Dakota nodded once, as if that was enough. Clara, curled in the blanket beside them, finally spoke. Her voice was hoarse, like it had forgotten how to work. "Can we plant something there?" Silas looked at her. "What do you want to plant?" She thought for a moment. "Peaches." He smiled. It hurt to do, but it came all the same. "Then peaches it is." The road east was long, and not without hardship. A flooded bridge forced them to backtrack, and Dakota's wound reopened after a rough climb. But through every challenge, Clara walked more confidently. She picked berries, learned to fish with a line. She asked about the stars. Silas didn't always have the answers, but he gave her what he could. Often, she'd turn to Dakota, who would say nothing, but would draw pictures in the dirt. A bear for strength, a sun for hope, a hand for unity. Their journey brought them eventually to Boone's Creek, a wide stretch of land ringed by mountains and split by a glistening river. The homestead was long gone, just stone foundation and wildflowers now. But the earth was good. The soil smelled of promise. They built slow, one wall at a time. Dakota showed Clara how to weave bark into baskets, and Silas taught her how to hold a hammer without bruising her thumb. The cabin they raised was modest, but it stood tall against the wind. Spring arrived. Buds bloomed. One morning, Silas found Clara kneeling beside a small patch of earth. She had peach pits nestled in her palm. She looked up at him. "We'll have to wait a long time," she said. "Good things usually take time," he replied. Days passed into weeks. The scars of the winter softened, but never vanished. Dakota took to patrolling the outer trails. He never said it, but Silas knew he was watching, still protecting. Silas spent his nights by the fire, often silent, sometimes writing in the old journal he hadn't opened since before the fire took his family. One night Clara asked, "Do you miss them?" He didn't need to ask who. "Every day," he said. She leaned into him. "Do you think they'd be proud?" Silas didn't answer for a long while. Then, with a quiet nod, he whispered, "I hope so." Summer arrived with heat and honey-colored skies. The first green shoot broke from the peach soil. Just one, stubborn and small, but alive. Clara danced around it barefoot, laughter echoing across the valley. Silas watched her, heart heavy and full at once. Not every ghost could be buried. Not every wound healed clean. But here, under this wide sky, he had chosen to keep walking forward. Dakota eventually left, silent as always. One morning, his tracks pointed toward the northern ridge and vanished into pine. He left behind a carved feather, tied with sinew and bead. Clara wore it in her braid. Time moved on. They didn't rebuild the old world. Just shaped a new one, rough-edged and real. And every evening, when the light dipped below the hills, Silas would sit on the porch with Clara beside him, and they would share a slice of fresh bread, warm, soft, and earned. The kind you don't need to buy with coins, only with kindness. The kind you share with those who've seen the fire and still choose to rise. If this story moved you, give it a like. Share it with someone who needs to be reminded that even in the coldest winters, small hands can bring warmth. And if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel, because some stories, like peach trees, grow slow but change everything.